what we see around us, we don't believe that because we want to buy into standards.
We have to prove that we're good fathers. When, as far as the mothers, it's just assumed.
So I'll wait on the check. I'll keep my self-respect first.
I'm a black man trying to save a black man, and I noticed as I looked around the whole room, there's no one helping me.
The reality is, if it affects you, it affects me.
Joining us today is licensed psychotherapist Tasnim Sulaimin. Ms. Sulaimin has a private practice in the Philadelphia region with a concentration on relationship and sex therapy. Ms. Charlie Hills, who is an independent write-in candidate for Philadelphia City Council at Large. And we also have DJ Bentrock of Radio 1 Philadelphia, WBLS New York, and an educator at Capital Prep Charter School in Harlem, New York. Thank you for being here and joining us, joining me for this conversation. It's a very real topic that we need to bring more awareness to, that needs to be addressed. Domestic abuse. It affects everyone, and it really is a silent killer because it really takes a lot of lives of people, throughout the world every single day. And I think it's an embarrassing topic for a lot of people that we are ashamed of, if that makes sense. Ms. Taz, you are a psychotherapist, licensed psychotherapist, and your concentration is really in that area surrounding domestic abuse. So can we talk a little bit about, or I guess could you tell us, what is domestic abuse? How is it defined? For many people don't know when they're in it. Right. The signs and things to look for, so can you tell us what it is?
Yeah, well, domestic abuse is the intentional, coercive, it's underneath of it all, it's about power and control, but it's a very intentional act from one intimate partner to another, and it can include verbal abuse, it can include physical assault, it can include sexual abuse. So there's various forms of domestic abuse from one partner to another. And at the core of it, it is typically about power and control. That's so like it in the basics. Yeah.
It really is more than just physical, because the picture that a lot of us get when we think of domestic abuse, we think of hitting, right? Whether it be a man or a woman, children. We think of physical, but how does it start? Does it usually start physical, or does it start on another level?
That's a good question. I was actually going to say that maybe we should think about it as like a spectrum. So like physical abuse might be the very last place of the abuse. So typically it actually starts very much so with verbal abuse, insults, criticisms, putting somebody down, like contempt. Because it's a big difference in, couples argue, yes, of course, but there's a certain level of toxicness to the arguments where it would be like tearing somebody's entire being or character down, or looks, or self-esteem. So it typically starts with that, and then there's other forms of signs, such as like isolating your partner, a lot of jealousy, control. Isolation is a big part of it, because typically, an abuser doesn't want an abusee to have support systems. So there's a process of isolation that goes on. So there's a lot of different signs, I think, that people can think about when it comes to abuse that doesn't necessarily mean just physical. Oftentimes, physical is the culmination of those other signs. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. There's layers to it, as you said. So we're going to kind of try to get deep into that part of it, because there's a lot of healing, on the other end that's necessary. Ms. Charlie.
Yes, I just wanted to chime in on what Tad said as well, and what you mentioned earlier, in the fact that we can't really focus on the fact that it is abuse. Domestic abuse is about abuse. There's patterns of behaviors and signs that need to be recognized and brought forth in the community, so that people can identify these a checklist, I guess you could say, a checklist of things to do to get out of the situation that they're currently in, to reach out and to provide resources and programming. that will help with the maturity of healing process.
I'm so glad you said that you mentioned the community, because it's really, domestic abuse is not just isolated to any one culture, any one ethnic group. It affects everyone.
Yeah. Regardless of your age, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, your marital status. I mean, yes, income as well. I mean, it affects everyone. It does not discriminate.
And that's another thing, the power of control. Financial abuse is huge, right?
And those are like different tactics or methods that an abuser might go through, because, or those are also a part of the reasons why, you know, somebody who's being abused may not feel free to leave, you know, because financial coercion is a huge one. That's livelihood, especially if there are children involved. So, you know, there's so many layers to it.
DJ Bentrop, she mentioned children. You are an educator. Most people know you as being a radio DJ, but you have a passion outside of that. You are an educator for charter school system. I will disclose, I was a child in an abusive household. So I'm a child of DV. And so with that, I know that some of the things that I went through as a result, you know, of being in that environment. Every day you go to work dealing with children who come to school, probably even suffering through some depression, and have to, you know, cope through what they just went through the night before at home, from with their parents. How do you handle that? And just, you know, talk to us a little bit about how serious it is.
A lot of children come to school, and the result of what they deal with in the home environment, we get the result in school. Case in point, I'll flash back to, we had what we call a student-led conference, where the child brings in their parents to present something. And you can see some of the dysfunction of a mother who is dealing with a boyfriend. And you can tell that the boyfriend is abusing the mother, therefore the mother is pressured to lash out on children, especially if the children is not the product of the boyfriend and the mother. So then the child becomes pressured. They don't know how to respond, and they respond negatively at the school. And they don't know how to deal with it. I'm dealing with 13, 14, 15-year-olds.
Wow.
We're not talking about people.
So they're already going
20s.
through changes.
They're going through their own changes.
Yeah.
They're going through peer pressure amongst. They're dealing with a lot of different challenges. Some are financial. I'm dealing with inner city minority children, about 85% black. So they're dealing with a lot of different issues. Plus the fact that their mom is going through an abusive relationship. They don't know how to deal with it, because they don't know how to deal with it. So they deal with it in a negative fashion.
Right. So how does it affect them academically? I'm sure you're able to see it, you know, in their grades. And does it also result in suspensions and fights?
Suspension, fights, and most importantly, negative, they're not progressing academically. They're 2-3 grade levels behind in reading, 2-3 grade levels behind in math, and they don't want to do anything, because a lot of them stay at school because they're afraid to go home. They don't want to go home.
Wow. And so this is the reality of what you're seeing on the other side, that the parents aren't able to see, because the parents are so deep into their own, I guess, space, right? So they're not able to pay attention to the challenges that the child, you know, is having through this emotionally, right? So what do you do as the educators, the administrators in the school? How do you handle that? Do you call a parent-teacher conference and try to, you know, draw out things that you may think you are identifying and ask questions?
I have 12, I call it advisees, that I deal with one-on-one first and foremost. So it's a process. You can't really find the root of the problem instantaneously. Sometimes it takes 9-10 months to try to figure out what's going on. I have some students that I've had for 3 years, and I've had them in 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, now 9th grade, and I'm finally getting to the root of the problem. Oh, your dad is not around, and your mom's boyfriend doesn't really like you. Oh, you know, so you have to try to do that. You try to talk to the parents, and you can get a sense of what the parent is dealing with just by the basis of how they're dealing with their children. I was fortunate to have a very functional family where, through my eyes, my parents always held my brother and myself as a priority. Sometimes we don't get that from parents, especially or a woman or a man that's dealing with their relationship. So they don't really, the kid becomes secondary or tertiary. So that's what we're dealing with.
Well, majority of the urban community come from broken households. So there's not a two-parent family, healthy home, right?
So case in point, a child coming to me and says, can I borrow $1? A lot of times they're afraid to ask the mother because the mother is working on a tight budget, who's dealing with an abusive relationship where that man is kind of holding her hostage financially. So it rolls down. It really rolls down because the dysfunction. So the byproduct is a child not progressing, a child repeating the 7th grade 3 times.
Miss Charlie, I know you have a lot to say because, yes, you're here to try to find other avenues to provide the resources to help us with these matters. What's your plan or your thoughts, about it, especially as it relates to the children?
Right. So I would like to ask Bent Rock, what have you found, or what would you suggest as far as programming or resources that could be developed to better help the children, because they are the product of these toxic relationships in the city?
Well, I'm also a psychology major, so I deal with this as far as observing. First, there's no quick fix. I've dealt with this issue at the school. This is my 3rd year in that school, so I've grown with some of the children. So you just got to develop I'm actually putting a program together for my advisory in the school of one-on-one and just kind of peeling off each child. Because as a child, when I grew up, I just saw my parents wake up. They dealt with us first thing in the morning. When I came home, they dealt with us. We always felt that we were the primary source of their function in the day. That's not the case with these children. Right. They are not, they barely have clothes to put on. Some barely even have $1 to buy food. So it's basically being their parent. And when I say being their parent, you don't really, they slowly, now they come running to me with issues. They come, where they wouldn't before, they don't open up. So it's got to be a consistent one-on-one. You start unraveling, you learn about their strengths and weaknesses. I have one that I thought was really challenged in certain areas. He's great in science. He's great in math. I didn't know this in 2 years. So that's because I'm dealing with him more one-on-one. A lot of them are dealing with, besides the abusiveness, because they don't have the parents to lean on, they're dealing with gang issues, peer pressure. So it's just being a stable factor within that time period, day in and day out, and then they have someone to come to, and then you can deal with some of those issues. And then you can probably call into the parent and say, hey, what's going on? Because as a result, your child is not functioning, or as a result, they're lashing out. So what's going on at home? But it takes time. You can't just come in Monday and then call the parent in on Wednesday and then it's a quick fix.
Right. So what I'm gathering is perhaps maybe having more trainings for teachers on site, or having them go to additional resources outside to gain that perspective of what an educator can do, because children are spending majority of their time in their care.
And but what's happening with the parent, you used the word that it was embarrassing. Another word is intimidating. When you're being abused, you're intimidated. So when you're intimidated, you don't as a parent, you don't know how to respond. So you have to figure out a way to, even as a teacher, to approach that parent and say, hey, what's going on? Because they're being intimidated.
Right.
Well, so then we can get to it's a very intimidating thing.
Okay. Taz, from a psychology perspective, how do you tackle these issues to do damage control, I guess, if that makes sense? Like, do you start, okay, well, let's treat the child, because they're really within, I guess, the care of the school, and then it filters to the parent in some way? How do you handle that?
Well, first I wanted to add in regards to the question about, how to protect children specifically, because when you think about it, children are helpless. And that's why we have so many systems and structures in place that are designed for not just parents, but also community, and pretty much every system that a children would touch base with, whether it be schools or therapy or doctor's office. Like, you have what's called mandated reporters. Yes. So anybody who works with children, in addition to having to have child abuse clearances and criminal background clearances, everybody, they have implemented, everybody has to be a mandated reporter, which is that if you suspect that you are legally required to call Childline, which is a national hotline. I mean, of course, we have it locally, and Childline does the investigation. as far as whether or not, you know, the child is safe. And I think there is a lot of fear sometimes when people talk about calling Childline. But I used to work in the schools also before I had private practice, and I've seen many times where, let's say you want a family to have resources because they really need the resources and you don't know how to help. Childline is not just the agency that comes and takes your kids away. I think that's what people think.
Right.
I mean, if the child is really being abused and is not safe, we want that. We all want that, right? But that happens very infrequently, that, you know, a system goes out to the house to investigate. But what I've seen more times than not is parents get the resources they need for food, for clothing, for programming. So sometimes we have to really understand that Childline is meant to protect the children and the families. And oftentimes by calling Childline, you get a family access to resources they might not have. So I did just want to put that out there. But in regards to, you asked about like should we start with the child or start with the parent? So when I used to work in the schools, I actually now specifically work with adults. I did feel like working with the child as a therapist, it was like working from the outside in, because again, the child is not in control of their environment at all. And so no matter what you do with the child to try to help them, which is, by the way, easier because kids change, and in a lot of ways are more resilient than adults because they don't have all of the layers and the layers and the layers of re-traumatization going on yet if they're younger. But I found that no matter what I do, how effective I am as a therapist, they're going home to an environment where their parents need therapy, their parents need mental health care, their parents need resources. So I felt like the way I could better make be effective with helping children was to try to help parents and relationships, like better, healthier relationships would produce safe, you know, like better parenting skills, better attachment, and also like have happier, healthier kids. So in addition to kids needing the treatment, I think that there does need to be a systemic component, and there is in schools, like there's a lot of resources there where you can offer that to the families as well and to the parents to get the help they need.
All right, hold that thought. We'll be right back. Like It Is back, and we have a question or comment.
My name is Shirley J. Carter, and my question is about homelessness. Homelessness is a big problem in the United States at this time, and with domestic abuse, women have to leave their spouses, and there's a possibility that they would become homeless. What is being done about this?
Thank you.
It's a great question. I do want to give out this resource because that is one of the fears of why women or men might not want to leave a domestic abuse situation. I just want to make sure that I have the right number, but there is a national domestic abuse hotline number, and if you call this number, they will give you all of the resources that are available to you, including housing, because that is one of the needed resources. And that number is, this is the Philadelphia Domestic Violence Hotline number. It is 1-866-723-3014. Be safe. And so if you call that, it's a 24-hour number that you can call for domestic abuse resources, including shelter, because that's a very real
private.
fear. Yeah.
Right.
I just want to expand upon that the city does have a Office of Domestic Violence Strategies, and it's located at 1401 JFK. I believe it is Suite 630, where they do offer resources on one-on-one that people can receive, in addition to the hotline number as well.
And I know in New Jersey, Camden County, well, actually all the counties, but Camden County particularly, because I'm a volunteer there, has what's called the Domestic Abuse Response Team that is partnered with the Camden County Women's Center, and they have a safe house that is a shelter available for any victim, for men, women, children, to be able to go to. And then there's a process to get that victim into housing. So they, you go to the shelter, and then they navigate you through the system and go through the process to get you approved for housing and, and work programs and whatever may be available, needed. Any other questions from our audience or comments?
My name is Angela Wooder, and I just want to make a comment that I have been sitting in the audience and learned a lot as far as triggering. I like that with what I didn't never know that I was involved. I wasn't involved with domestic violence, but my mom, you know, I watched them beat her up and her husband and all that. So, and I never kind of figured that it would be triggering something in me because I was a child. That we had to go next door or down the street and knock on people's doors, you know, so they can call the cops. So, I'm just kind of like amazed that I was hearing comments of the psychologist, you're a psychologist?
I'm not a psychologist, but I'm a licensed therapist. Yes.
Licensed therapist, that you could be triggered by those kind of actions in your childhood.
Did it affect you in school? Did that affect your school?
I don't know how it would affect me in my school.
Did you act out in school? Did it affect your grading, like when you were struggling in grades? Anything like that?
Well, no, I made honor roll at one time, but and I was the best dressed and all that, but
behavior-wise.
But far as me with relationships now, I think that might have a trigger.
Okay.
Yeah, it might have triggered some stuff like that because right now, and I'm like away, you know, with the men, I kind of like try to control them because of my mom's situation. I guess that they was beating her up, and I'm not gonna let nobody, you know, do that to me.
That's
So,
right. That's
you
right.
know,
Yeah.
I might have to see you.
Thank you. Thank you
And there's
for that
nothing wrong
comment.
with it
Yeah,
because
no,
I
thank
might
you
need
for
to
that
see her
comment.
too.
And what you just said, so there's this thing, like when we're traumatized, we polarize. We go to the opposite, the extreme opposite. So like what you said, like, oh, well, if nobody's gonna beat me, so now we can be like overzealous about it, and it can like manifest in almost like a control issue that still causes disconnect in relationships because it's not the healthy balance of vulnerability. So now it might just be coercive on the other end, but to make sure that you don't get abused, if that makes sense.
Yeah, another thing too, I drive a school bus, and I'm the first one that sees the kids when they get on the bus. So I have experience, we wouldn't know if it's child abuse, but I mean child molestation, where the kid we dropped them off at the grandparents' house, and they were scared to death, and they cry, and you know, like, oh no, don't
Definitely
go
something going on
So
there.
with something going on there, me and the aide was like, should we say something? Should we tell? You know, but the aide, I believe, called the school, and then they checked it out, and I don't know what happened besides that, but you know, that's a real major issue sometimes. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome
for sharing that.
Thank you.
What you said is key, Taz, because I can be transparent enough to say that that's how I responded from my childhood environment, you know, going all the way to not wanting to be controlled. It's just like, you absolutely, you know, okay, I'm not going to, you know, start anything here, but you're not going to control me. And is it like a defense mechanism, perhaps?
Absolutely, yeah. It's like an extreme, almost like an extreme defense mechanism. And so it makes sense because it's like what you have developed as your protector.
Right.
Our defense mechanisms do serve purpose in some way because they're trying to protect us. They have good intentions. There we go with the intentions. They have good intentions. But they sometimes fail because then we still wonder, well, why am I still struggling in relationships? Because the defense mechanisms that we develop sometimes are so extreme that they still don't result in healthy relationships, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Another issue that we haven't talked about that is very real, and it gets swept under the rug, okay? Molestation. Yes. It happens too often to children, you know, within the families. Can either one of you, you know, if you just want to chime in a little bit, you know, from your experiences?
I know 4 scholars that have probably dealt with some form of molestation. And it's very hard to get that out of them. You have to try to almost play detective. And you have to, first of all, you have to develop a trust factor. So, because they're not going to say anything to you unless they trust you. And then you have to understand their family environment as to what's going on. A lot of the children are dealing with dysfunctional, imbalanced family environment. And they're being, remember, at between 12 and 15, they're developing. And there's some sort of molestation going on. So it's very hard to pinpoint it unless a child really says, hey, Mr. Clark, I need to talk to you about something. And then how do you deal with it? But I'm sensing at least 4 or 5 that, and you can tell in the way they walk, the way they're shy, the way they move. And that's just me. I'm just, from my observation.
Because it affects their self-esteem.
Yes.
Just like any form of domestic abuse, right?
Exactly.
It has it weighs on the self-esteem.
Exactly.
Right.
So how do you deal with it? The first thing is you have to figure out what is going on. And you cannot do that when it comes to children unless they trust you. It's not going to happen. So, because a lot of times they don't trust their own family environment. So a lot of times they wake up, who am I trusting? Where, case in point, they might be trusting somebody on the street, a gang member, or somebody that's older that doesn't have their best interest in mind. So that's the whole thing. Identification becomes key, but identification and trust to try to figure it out.
I was going to co-sign with DJ Bentrock because prior to me running for city council, I was working with DHS, Department of Human Services, here in Philadelphia, and working with the Hotline Child Care Unit, we had several clients that would come into us who, like you said, you have to develop a level of trust with them in order for them to disclose this information, because when they come in to us and they don't know you from a can of paint, you know, to them, you're just another stranger or someone else who might be trying to separate them.
What are you going to do to me?
Exactly.
Right.
And then what can you do for me?
Right.
Because it's one of those things where they don't see you as a resource or someone they can truly trust to come to with this information. So yes, developing a relationship, and from my perspective, it was a short period of time that we would have them in our care, because they would go on to a social worker or to a caseworker, you know, and then sometimes eventually to family court. So, you know, you only have a few moments to try to gather that information and then try to let them know that you're there to assist and to help, you know, and developing that rapport with them is so key, because they do need someone there in their corner to help them through this, because it is a process.
I just wanted to address what DJ is saying, DJ Bentrock is saying about not, you know, wanting to get help. So that first part of hurt people, the other part of that is healed people heal people. So that is exactly why these platforms, normalizing discussion, what we're doing right now is breaking a stigma. Like, so sometimes people think, oh, you know, it's not a big systemic thing that needs to happen to break a stigma. I have this organization called Black Men Heal, and our logo is Healed Men Heal Men. So, like, you know, like, say, for example, a male like you or a man that I've seen goes to that corner and talks to his homies to normalize it. Because one man stepping into the space of transparency and vulnerability leads to another man being willing to do it as well.
That's right.
Yeah. We're not going to be able to, when I say we, I'm talking about the black community. We're not going to be able to heal ourselves until we educate ourselves, because the problem is a lot of these systematic problems come from the fact that I'm not educated enough to have a job that's going to sustain me and to sustain the person I love. Therefore, it creates pressure. Pressure creates frustration. Frustration creates anger. Anger creates violence. So you see, A, B, C, D, E. So that's why I went back to educate, because if we don't start getting to some of these problems that we deal with every day we wake up, I'm in the ghetto, or there are roaches and rodents running around in the house, I can't deal with, I don't have a car, I cannot get to work, I cannot pay my bills. These things happen. So we have to start developing that problem and addressing that problem, so it takes some pressure off. So then I can start dealing with some psychological issues or some behavioral issues, because when I'm dealing with that, as a man, a black man, when I'm dealing with that kind of problem, there's going to be a spillover.
And which may be why some people rather deal with other people's issues and they kind of divert it away from themselves, because, you know, I guess it's too much mess if you say. We'll be right back. Like It Is back, and we're continuing our conversation about domestic abuse, this being Domestic Abuse Awareness Month. And we're talking about children, how children are affected with domestic abuse. Let's talk about trauma a little bit, and exactly what that is, and the developmental how trauma can even affect the developmental stages of a child who is in a DV environment.
Yeah, I think this is a really important topic because trauma, this is going to sound biased, of course, as the therapist saying this, but I believe trauma is one of the realest, biggest epidemics in our country because over 70% of people have trauma, and trauma is pretty much anything that has happened to you in your life that you have directly experienced or witnessed, or even just, it doesn't even have to affect you directly. There's a whole thing on intergenerational trauma where you might be affected by the trauma or the abuse or the psychological issues that your parent has had and you haven't directly experienced. But trauma is anything that happens to threaten your sense of psychological, emotional, physical safety. So it can be abuse, it can be a car accident, it can be just that moment where you feel like there's a part of our brains called the amygdala. It is the fight, flight, or freeze syndrome, right? And that is the part that is activated. It's the survival center of the brain that's activated when we, like if somebody comes in here right now and says, oh, there's a gun, like it's the part of us that has to go off so we can get up and run, right? So it's an important part. But when people are constantly traumatized, what we're finding is that that part is always activated. So a lot of people who come from inner city homes or from families where there's been a lot of domestic abuse or substance abuse, that part, their survival brain, they're living their whole lives in survival brain. And that is not healthy. So now there's a lot more research around the connection between mental health and physical health. So they have this thing called the ACE scores, which is, it measures your childhood experiences. And now they're seeing that depending on the higher of the risk factors of childhood trauma that you have experienced, it is a direct link to serious health issues such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and a lower lifespan. So there is a connection between trauma and literally quality and health of life. So that's why mental health is just so important. It'll always be important to me because it really does need to be as important and as critical in our process of advocating and educating people as physical health.
It's interesting because the Black community suffers with diabetes, right? And heart disease. So that could potentially, what you're saying, be linked to the untreated trauma that is not even recognized, right? That can go way back. Let's talk about men. We when we think of domestic abuse, right, it's generally really centered around women and children, because women and children are mostly the victims. 94% of women actually are murder-suicide victims, and because it's that silent killer that we talk about. But men are victims too. And DJ Bentrock, I guess you're a man, so you can perhaps you could speak on this more. Why are men so quiet about it when they're in an abusive relationship?
There's a thing called barbershop psychology. Barbershop is the domestic domain for men that we go to once or twice a week, where we exercise our macho charisma. So if I'm DJ Bentrock and hey, how you doing? What's your name? Let's go out and get something to eat. I'm the one in control. If all of a sudden it's flipped on me, I'm not going to, who am I going to tell somebody? That's almost like, you're not the dominant person, because we are trained to be the dominant. We cannot be weak. So if I was to go to a friend, a therapist, I'm coming off as weak. So I'm going to try to figure this out myself, or I am just going to retreat in my hole and try to figure this out. And then days become weeks, weeks become months, and then you'll see a character change in my personality, because I'm not trying to, who am I going to tell? I'm DJ Bentrock. So I'm just giving you the psychology of what a lot of men think
And there's a
about.
deep-rooted layers of pain now after years of this buildup that now Taz has to do a real hard job trying to pull out to heal.
And I
if
might
that
not go.
ever
I'm not
happens.
going to her to tell her that.
Why? So
Because
why
no.
is it? What is the why do? It's not just men. A lot of women, and it is cultural too. Why is it that so many adults are totally against psychotherapy and anything related to mental health?
Well, okay, so I think specifically in the African American community, we definitely have to address that the stigma that is associated with mental health, because we come from, you know, the age of, like, you know, what happens in the home stays in the home, right? So we come from that, right? And I mean, I could go real deep with it and say how I think, like, even going back to like slavery days, like how we have been socialized and conditioned in this way, because we as Black people, like, you know, it's Black strength, and don't get me wrong, because we are a strong people, but I also have some theories around how Black pain is often labeled as Black strength, because Black pain is always suppressed.
Yes.
And we always, there's a lot of, anytime, secrecy. And anytime there's secrecy, there's shame. So a lot of the way in which we have been conditioned mentally, emotionally, psychologically, and as far as in our society, I think that has, like, contributed to these elements of stigma and shame. And I think what you're saying is very real, which is that it's too many people who are like, oh no, I wouldn't go talk to somebody about this. But there is a lot of connection between, I wanted to say about like that holding in pain, avoiding pain, suppressing pain. Well, one, it doesn't work, but two, people are trying to find a way, because it keeps coming up in their bodies and in their systems, because even when you're trying to avoid it, you're going to keep being triggered. And triggers, like, I mean, taking all of this back, if you look at the connection between, like, this pain, or like even starting with the kids, trauma, right? You know, they don't know how to process it. They grow up with it. Then they maybe start to internalize a lot, holding in a lot, constantly triggered. And if you're a male, you're like, I don't know what to do with this. I can't talk about it. You're always feeling pain. You're always experiencing trigger. Then you're self-medicating and numbing, because substance abuse is a very big part of domestic violence. So people are medicating with substance. We have an opioid crisis in our country. People are trying to numb from pain because they don't know what else to do with it, you know? And it is sad and unfortunate. And then what happens is, then of course substances, you know, is now exacerbating these issues of pain, mental health, trauma, PTSD, and people are not acting or behaving in their best mindset, clearly, when they're under the, you know, under substances.
Influence.
Yeah, so then that, like, there's a cycle, like, it's all interconnected if you look at it. Like, that could lead to domestic violence, because I don't know what to do with these emotions or with these feelings, and I'm mad, and, you know, first thing I do when I'm mad is I gotta lash
Get it out.
Right,
And you take it out on the person closest to you, or people closest to you.
Or whoever the trigger is.
There's a negative indoctrination of Black men. We wake up Black, we wake up male, and we wake up that we are going to fail. And the problem is that if I'm failing and I don't have control of my relationship with my woman, and she's beating down on me like, we can't pay the rent. I can't pay the rent. What are you doing? You know what I'm saying? Why are we in this broke down car? That's abuse. But I've been indoctrinated to fail, so then I don't know how to deal with this. I'm trying to deal with paying my own rent. And then what happens is we're not educating ourselves. We're not, we're not educating. So I try to teach my scholars, when you make a decision could be just, you're gonna grow locks. Okay, you grow locks, you know what kind of consequences you might face.
Right.
You need to know those things, but you're not educating. So then when you go into a job interview, you don't get that job, you just think you failed. No, we're not setting ourselves up. So, and that's the same thing goes for relationships. We're not setting ourselves up to communicate. So that's what happens. So now the female is giving me problems. I don't know how to react to it. I don't know how to react. And I'm not going to my boys in the barbershop.
So could you perhaps react based on the example that you saw? So if you saw daddy react and smack mommy, so now you might react. So is domestic abuse kind of like that pattern?
It can be. It can be intergenerational, because it doesn't there's always exceptions to every rule, but is there a risk factor in the research? Yes, like normally trauma is a risk factor, like that would, you know, like if they're studying somebody who has been in domestic abuse or who has like dosed out domestic abuse. Yes, there's been trauma. Yes, there has been possibilities of witnessing or being abused, witnessing abuse in the home or being abused themselves. And if you think about it, I once had a client who told me that he didn't realize until he was 20 years old that everybody wasn't just living in houses where people fought all the time.
Wow.
And when you start thinking about that, it's deep, because if you are a child and your introduction into the world is your family, that's all you really know behind those closed doors.
So that's normal to you, right?
to like it's this idea of like, oh, this is what love looks like. This is what family looks like. So like you start to internalize all of those things that you're seeing and that you're experiencing, and it is normal. And we reenact familiar, actually, and so that's why it does become a risk factor.
So like a woman who is always just go from one relationship to the next, and every relationship, this man is beating her down. It's that pattern that she has, that familiarity, I guess what you're saying.
Yeah,
that she
familiarity.
just, because it feels like love.
Right.
And she thinks that this is what it's supposed to be.
Right.
So let's talk about that then. What are some, I guess, the healthy or unhealthy, both healthy and unhealthy signs of a relationship? Because there's so many people who, they're in something now. And they keep trying to get this person to change. You know, he or she won't change. And I don't know why, you know, they do keep doing this or doing that, but not recognizing perhaps they have to start with self first and recognizing what's broken with self, right? Because we are a mirror.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And then, you know, to be able to recognize the unhealthy parts, I guess, of self and why they're choosing the unhealthy parts of, am I making, that makes sense?
It makes a ton of sense.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, what is a healthy relationship? I'm going to share a will that I use with clients for you, and then maybe you could use it for the show.
Okay.
But at the very, very core of this will is respect. It is respect for self and respect for others, and knowing what your values are, knowing what is important to you, because values are the things that are most important to us, and they shape our behaviors and our beliefs and our behaviors. So respect is at the core of that. And then the other elements that are there, of course, are safety. You have to feel mentally, physically, emotionally safe in order to have a healthy relationship. Accountability for you and your partner. If you want to be in a healthy relationship, you have to be willing to know we're two wounded people who are coming together trying to make a life work, and subconsciously we're all trying to heal our wounds in some way, right? So we don't go in and say, hey, here's my wound, babe, can you help me out with this? But our romantic partners are going to trigger those wounds more than anybody, because that's the relationship that is most familiar to the family relationship. So accountability, honesty, trust, communication. So these are all elements of a healthy relationship, the core ingredients. And I think that, you know, when people, and I definitely believe what you said earlier, it has to start with self. You know, all of those elements have to start with self. So the more that you are self-aware of what your issues are, you know, because we all got them. There's nobody that don't have them, right?
Absolutely.
There's nobody, in my opinion, that doesn't need or would not benefit from working some things out through therapy, right? But knowing what they are, knowing when they're triggered, knowing how to regulate that emotion when it comes up, and how to transform it and learn how not to act on it or project it. That's a big part of it. Like a lot of times we're projecting triggers onto our partner. So, and the interesting thing about relationships, working with couples, is that, like, you know, our partners are not often trying to hurt us unless they just trying to hurt us. But most of the stuff I see in my office is like, you know, somebody could be walking to the kitchen and go get a beer, and somehow, some way, they don't know what it was about that, but that has somehow triggered something in somebody, and they're like, well, that wasn't my intention, you know, and somebody's reacting. And one of the things I always say in my office is like, intention is irrelevant to this work, because your intention, we're not often trying to hurt our partners, right? again, unless we're just being vindictive, because now they hurt me, because hurt people hurt
Right,
people.
hurt people, right.
You hurt me, so now I'm gonna
I
hurt
gotta
you
get you
back.
back, right.
So sometimes we're trying to hurt back, but typically the wound happens and it's like, oh, it wasn't really intentional. So like trying to help people to understand that your triggers are, you know, your emotions and your triggers are your responsibility. They are not your partner's. You have to learn how to regulate your own emotions and learn how to manage them and soothe them is what I teach people a lot. And so that you are not constantly triggered, or when you are triggered, you recognize that it's a trigger and you're like, this is what I need to do for me.
Right.
Not like, oh, my partner, I'm mad. My partner needs to somehow, some way make me less mad. That don't work.
But see, you talk about those triggers. So a lot of times, what we might be, what we think our partner triggered, you know, what our partner did to us, it's usually something that's already there from before, right?
I tell them all the time, your partner didn't cause that wound, they just tripped over it on their way to the kitchen to go to get the beer. They just tripped, oh, dang, I didn't even know there was a wound there. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
DJ Bent Rock, Charlie, any you have any
You know,
feedback?
what you're saying is really good, and I always talk about theory and reality. Every time I mention to somebody I'm a psych major, they back up. When you mention therapy, they have this picture in their mind of a long couch with somebody in a white robe and glasses with a clipboard, and that becomes very intimidating. So getting people to talk about it, and that's a long trip for some people. I'm not going, because they think one flew over the cuckoo's nest. Like it's one of those things where we have to tear down that wall of perception, because when you say, maybe you need to go get some help. What do you mean I need to get some help?
Listen, I have been to therapy. It has been very beneficial to me.
But you got there though. There's a lot of people that are on the corner right now that will not do it. They're too proud and loud to say, I need to go see her or anybody. No, seriously, because it's almost saying that there's something wrong with you and they can't be fixed. So we have to get to that point.
It's a denial.
Yeah, we have to get to that point, because there's an image of, no, I'm not that bad off. So. Yeah.
Charlie, so, I'm sorry, you were going to make a
No, I was just going to say, bringing awareness like this platform here is a step in the right direction, because the simple fact that it's conversational at this point. It's not more or less like we're in an office setting where there's a sofa and you think you got to lay down and stretch out and express everything. You know, it's something that we need to start doing around holidays, you know, just talking and gathering together, because a lot of people break bread over food.
Right.
And that conversation, you know, because it's the time we need to learn about our history, our family. And
that's the time actually when a lot of people are triggered,
absolutely,
who have that baggage, right?
Yeah,
that time if they don't, it's just that time that actually leads to a lot of depression.
That is true.
On that note, Like It Is, we'll be right back. Like It Is back, and we have another question from our audience. Please, your name, please.
My name is Donald Terry.
Hi, Donald.
Good. I'd like to thank the panel today, because what I'm going through today, it kind of connected with me emotionally and traumatized me. I have a friend that usually stop by every now and then, and there's another part to this. Someone's just following that person and putting notes in my door. We don't have a relationship or nothing like that. So last week, they put a firebomb in my door. Now I'm in the house. I feel like somebody was coming through the front door. So now I'm learning that that's kind of sort of like traumatizing me in a way. So it's putting me on another level on the defense. I totally don't have no relationship with the young lady, but I'm kind of angry and I'm mad, and I'm trying to keep from going to the next level. So I'm glad to be here, because it brought a lot insight on where I'm at today with myself.
So this is a stalking situation that you're referring to? Okay.
Yeah. And I could see the different levels progressing. And I'm a person like this.
Just step up to the mic just a little bit.
I'm a person like this. I don't like to get angry, because I don't know where it's going to take me.
Right.
When I was a child, it took me someplace where I didn't want to be. And I'm trying to stay from that. And by being here today, I'm actually learning that at certain levels and there's some things. Do you guys take insurance, by the way?
I take some insurance. We could talk after the show.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that's all I have to say. I'm just glad to be
Thank
here.
you.
I just had to share that.
I appreciate and respect you stepping up to say
Yes,
something
being
because I know it took, as a man, you know, that took a lot.
Yeah, so
yes.
I have to go get my artillery because ain't nobody coming in my house.
Well, you have to protect yourself.
They got to go to the front door, but when you start coming in, it's a different story.
And that's an example of a male who's experiencing
Yes.
some abuse
Yes.
by a female, because that's real too. I mean, you know, that happens as well. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you. That's huge.
And he also touched on something that I'd like to, just incorporate with this campaign. Just being able to provide safe and supportive policies and putting in place programs that can assist with all children, youth, and families, because he mentioned insurance. So that can be a deterrent for some people who do not have
absolutely.
it and who want to receive the help but can't. Right?
Absolutely. We have one more question, another question from our audience.
So I have a question in terms of domestic abuse, but on a different subject than like hitting or traumatizing people in that way. What about the domestic abuse of hoarding, where I think people use hoarding as a way to get at their spouse and get them upset and traumatize them?
I've never heard of or thought of hoarding as a form of domestic abuse. I do know that hoarding is a very real issue that I have been presented with in therapy, or like people have been raised in households with mother or father who was a hoarder. But it's a sign of emotional deprivation. That's where it comes from, hoarding. And it can manifest into obsessive, compulsive disorder. So it's like a anxiety disorder at a very extreme level, if that makes sense. But when you have some underlying disorders there, that might contribute to, because that, again, people might be hoarding to try to deal with the stress, almost like drugs or substances. So a lot of times I think there are other issues that people have that can be interconnected that could lead to more extreme domestic violence.
But I'm saying, for example, somebody hoards as a way not only to protect themselves from whatever trauma they may have had, but also to lash out at the people who are closest to them.
So what she's saying is maybe if they know their partner doesn't like the the hoarding, that they maybe get even more excessive with it as a way to to get back at them because they know they purposely don't like it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh wow.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's deep. When you think of the ways in which we try to hurt people or punish them.
Could that possibly fall under what you were saying earlier, where we might think that our partner is doing this purposely to get at us, but like we were saying, those.
If somebody's doing that intentionally, that's a issue, because hoarding is a very real issue that people don't have control over. So if they're doing it intentionally, there is something else going on, more spite or just trying to hurt somebody, because most hoarders cannot control the issue or the behavior, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Like It Is, we'll be right back. Like It Is back. I would like to thank our panelists today for joining in this very necessary conversation, because DV is so real. It's so real that we're going to have another show, because there's so many layers to this, like we said, right? So if any one of you, do you want to share any final thoughts, any resources or information to give our audience, please? You have the platform.
Well, one of the things that came up, somebody asked about insurance, and obviously with mental health. I did want to just give a little plug to the organization, nonprofit I started, Blackman Hill, and it's an organization that takes all of those barriers out of getting mental health support. So we give out free therapy, 8 free sessions to men of color, and we also recruit therapists of color to provide the sessions. So we eliminate the issue of a man of color, for example, not having a therapist who can identify with his unique cultural needs, and we also help remove the stigma. So that's blackmenhill.org.
Blackmenhill.org. Thank you. DJ Bentrock.
One of the exercises I taught my children is reflection is really, really deep. If you can reflect, then you can find the source of your problem. Think of your earliest memory, 3 earliest memories, and try to give me 2 positive, 1 negative. If you cannot give me 2 positive and 1 negative, it's indicative of what your childhood may have been.
That's
so
deep.
think of 3 earliest memories, 2 positive and 1 negative.
Charlie Hills.
Yes, I've gathered such great information that is going to assist with me in developing programming, because I feel it's so important that we start engaging in this topic in our communities and citywide, and absolutely being able to provide those resources that are necessary that aren't so abundant as other things.
Wow. One of the things that we didn't touch on, and then we're going to have it in our next show, is elder abuse, because that does fall under the category of domestic abuse, and it's very common. You know, it's almost like, you know, men who are victims, you know, that it's just not really, it's kind of taboo. So I like to thank each and every one of you.
Thank you.
And again, which that email, that website, blackmenhill.org.
Blackmenhill.org.
All right, and DJ Bentrock, maybe we need to have some healing music for the next show.
The healing playlist. Yes.
All right, that's the show. Thank you so much. I am Eunice Smith, your host, and this is Like It Is.